Let me start by saying I'm not a historian. Obviously, I try to keep track of historical evidence and stuff, but it's fairly casual for me, and so I'm going to miss things. I'm going to be ignorant of some sources and whatnot. So please, if you have corrections, let me know. Great example. There is a freestyle wrestling manual from Armand Cherpelad, or I don't know how to pronounce it. It was written in French, and I was under the assumption that freestyle was also French, just like Greco-Roman is actually just a renamed French flat-hand wrestling. And it turns out he's actually Swiss, and freestyle was actually a Swiss style of wrestling. So there you go. Gaps in knowledge and whatnot. Anyway, so I wanted to briefly kind of ponder the question on where did high kicks come from? Now, before we get going, let's start off with the easiest first thing to say, which is like people have kind of always been interested in the capacity of their body to do cool and crazy things. I mean, we've got quotes from from ancient Greece, talking about how a man has no right to die without knowing the beauty and strength his body is capable of. People have been very interested in developing their bodies and their athletic capacities for a very, very long time. And it's not required that anything has a single point lineal history. There's this thing called convergent evolution, where basically similar problems will end up yielding similar solutions, provided that you have similar resources at hand, and thus you're going to see what are essentially copies of techniques or tools, or even overall like tactics concepts that don't have any clear link to each other, in any direct lineal fashion. So not everything needs to come from a single source. That's just a fact. But the question of where did high kicks come from, if we discount the idea that people have probably always dabbled with throwing their legs high between dance and combat and stuff, why is it that so many of what we consider traditional or historical systems do not show a lot of high kicking? Why is it that we kind of see high kicking show up in the 1900s, with maybe a couple of very small exceptions? And I think the biggest answer that we have is that the prevalence of low kicking not only makes more sense contextually, just in general from a human standpoint. I think you can bear out that, historically, like low kicking has always kind of made a little bit more sense, and kicking being somewhat sparse, more reserved, makes a little bit more sense when you look at the fact that like our folk styles of combat have always tended towards grappling globally. When you are grappling, then the idea of kicking, if you are involved in a style of grappling that does involve some striking, as most old styles did, oftentimes the striking that you would see, other than like can opener strikes to get to the next hook, a lot of times you'd be talking about leg kicking. You'd be talking about people getting upper body grips and then just trying to smash the legs out from underneath to get the other guy down. Whether you're talking about joint damage or just raw brute, smashing. In fact, when they talk about kicking in the London prize ring rules of boxing, they're specifically talking about the leg kicking that was so common in certain styles of English wrestling. They weren't talking about kickboxing. And when we look at kicking outside of, say, the English boxing tradition, where do we see kicking in HEMA, right? Your hands are occupied with weapons. So where do you see kicking? You see kicking to the groin and to the legs. Kind of makes sense. Where do you see kicking in like karate and kung fu styles? For the most part, we'll get to that in a second. For the most part, because you're dealing with a lot of close range, close quarters combat, you end up seeing kicking done while you're grabbing and holding somebody and kicking their legs out to chop them down and give yourself an advantage by putting them either taking away some of their mobility or simply taking away their ability to move around. And, plus just damage and the way that tilts the fight in your favor. So low kicking makes a ton of sense and is very much more intuitive. It also does a lot less to challenge. Your balance and your structure, and is harder to exploit than high kicking. It also requires a lot less room than high kicking and requires a lot less athletic capacity than high kicking. So when you put all those things together, that makes sense. So again, where does high kicking come from? Well, in the West, our high kicking tradition very much so comes from Sabat. And in, Sabat, we're talking about if you look at Joseph Charlemont, when he wrote his book, he was just of the idea of, if you can do more, you can do less. So you learn how to kick up to the head, not because you're going to use it, but because if it's not a strain to kick somebody in the head, kicking them in the body or the legs will be no challenge at all. And you'll have the dexterity and the balance and the structure and all of that to go along with it. It's a very sensible approach. And there is some evidence to suggest that Sabat, because of the French Empire and because of trade, that you actually see Sabat influencing, karate to maybe some small degree, if in nothing more than, the tournament format. But I would also suggest probably in the high kicking, because if you look at traditional karate systems, you do not see a lot of high kicking. Where do we see high kicking in Kung Fu? Well, for the most part, you see it in kind of like northern systems, but even in northern systems, it's not like ubiquitous. Almost everybody will point their high kicking towards northern Shaolin. Why does northern Shaolin have it? Well, again, not a historian, but also Kung Fu styles, Kung Fu origins are almost always at least 50% fiction, and it's really, really hard to track down the truth. Some of this is a cultural thing. We've talked about it before. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it literally has to do with perception and of being braggy and all of that. It was just considered more humble to attribute things that you created to somebody else who was more important than you. I said I wasn't going to get into it. I got into it. Anyway, the point is that when we look at Kung Fu styles, it is really, really, really hard to tell anything of historical accuracy. And quite often the things that we can tell of historical accuracy are fairly recent, and they don't stretch very, very far back, certainly not as far back as the legends tell. But if we look at Northern Shaolin, why would there be more high kicking in Northern Shaolin? Well, it's probably fairly safe to say that if you're talking fighting monks, that's the theory here, right? If you're talking fighting monks, they're probably not involved in sport wrestling, and they're almost certainly not involved in standard military affairs. Now, some of them may have joined the monastery after being in the military and so brought that too. And we also know that the monastery, the temple, was, a haven for travelers and for military people and whatnot to come and seek sanctuary. So, I mean, there's a lot of crossover there. But if you're talking about fighting monks, right, why are fighting monks going to be doing it? Well, a lot of the Shaolin Kung Fu that we see, not only are they kind of, becoming a repository for these other established styles of fighting, but the other thing that they're doing is they're practicing it in a civilian context, and they're practicing it in a fairly non-violent atmosphere, which allows them to explore their athletic capacity more, and it allows them to kind of explore less common things more, because now they're doing it almost more as a form of exercise and history preservation than anything. So you are now taking something out of its context and allowing the high kicking to flourish a little bit more because you're putting it into a context outside of where it was initially developed. So if the Northern Shaolin thing is part of the story, the reason that they have high kicking is probably because they could. We also have, down in Korea, we have Taekyon. You know, everybody's going to say, well, Taekwondo's got high kicking. Yeah, Taekwondo didn't exist until like the 1950s. And, you know, a lot of that was to differentiate themselves from the Chinese martial arts and the Japanese version of karate that they were allowed to practice. There's a whole thing there dealing with war and culture and imperialism and all of that. We're definitely not going to get into that. The point is that, again, I don't know much about the history of Taekyon, and what little I've been able to find, it's just not popular enough in English language sources to do a lot of stuff. My understanding, though, is it's not even really a martial art. It's more like a folk festival game kind of thing. But I guess it was like half wrestling, half kick the guy in the head, and as some kind of feat of something. And if you're talking about like a feat of like weirdly athletic wrestle tag, again, you're looking at a context that is very divorced from regular combat, and it gives people a chance to say like, oh, look, you can win the game if you do this really weird and crazy thing. In fact, the idea of putting a head kick in as a point scoring or winning condition is kind of to say this is a special and notable thing, not a normal mundane thing. And so the idea of throwing high kicks, now Taekwondo may have decided to specialize in kicking because they had this tradition of high kicking from one of their folk sports, and who knows where that came from. You know, it could have been a solely indigenous thing, it could have been a borrowed thing, but the fact is that, again, you're talking about kind of a weirdly like civilian, sporty, folky kind of context. You're not talking about a warfare context. You're not talking about a self-defense context. You're talking about people having, you know, time and energy to develop something in a more recreational way. So my overall point with this is not to do some historical expose, but more to give you the idea that like, I love high kicking. You know, I grew up watching Van Damme movies, and you know, the idea of like throwing, you know, big fancy high kicks and all that is just kind of part of it. You know, and like kickboxing was kind of invented, you know, like just before I was born. American kickboxing was invented like just before I was born. And that needed to have high kicking because it was boxing rules, so everything was waist up. So you had to be able to at least kick above the waist. And again, that is, you know, things are going to facilitate working into the rules, and that is something that's kind of divorced from the rest of it. Now, look, karate already had high kicking at that point, but again, they may have had that because of knowledge trading with you know, with the French and Savate kind of making its way over to the East. I mean, hell, like Sambo got a lot of its striking from Savate because that was like the French were just exporting that kind of stuff around. And even Savate started off with low kicking. Savate did not start off with high kicking because Savate started off as like a self-defense street fighting style and eventually moved into a sportive thing that was designed around personal development and sport and athletics. And so it developed into that. So time and time again, where we see high kicking pop up, we see it done in a context that is divorced from regular combat, whether armed or unarmed, you know, but we are talking about seeing it divorced from regular combat, and we're seeing it move into the realm of either like folk recreation, athletic pursuits, and sport, right? That kind of stuff. So, you know, does high kicking specifically have a lineal origin? Well, probably not. I think that you're just going to have all sorts of things out there of people occasionally throwing kicks well above their waist up toward the head and beyond, including with jumps and spins and all that kind of stuff, because we like to have fun and we like to explore our bodies. I mean, that's just part of being a human. It's part of being alive. It doesn't need to come from anywhere. But where we do start seeing it pop up as a more cultural phenomenon and not just a thing that people do, it starts becoming more apparent that where we see it is in very much more so a sport, athletic, recreational kind of setting. That's where we see high kicks start coming in, which does kind of indicate that you probably want to spend, especially your beginner time, whether you're teaching or whether you're starting on the brand new journey right now, and welcome to the martial arts community. Don't listen to all the naysayers, have fun, pick something you like, and go ham. But the point is that at the beginning, you probably want to develop not only solid upper body skills, but you want to develop a good solid base of standing, including standing on one foot, because believe it or not, even outside of kicking, standing on one foot does have its uses and is inevitable in many ways. And you're going to want to focus your kicking on probably low kicking. You're probably going to be looking at, foot stomps, ankle trips, and I'm talking like hard trips. I would still consider that part of kicking. Shin kicks, knee kicks, leg hooking. So hook kicking doesn't always have to be to just strike. Hook kicking can actually be almost in the vein of like a push kick, or in this case it would be a pull kick to break somebody's structure. So that's useful. Obviously, the ubiquitous soccer kick to the groin, it's useful. It's not as great as people make it out to be, but it is useful and it's fairly intuitive. And even some early kicking just above the belt, between the ribs and the waist. We'll talk about this another time, but just keep in mind, like hitting people where there's a lot of rib bones and muscle is like punching armor. It doesn't do a lot. So focus on the soft parts. The floating ribs are okay, and then the guts. Focusing in on the guts and the waist and the hip structure. As far as what your above the waist stuff goes, man, that's going to be your primary, let's say, up to and including the solar plexus. Make sure that as you're developing this, that you can very easily get to the solar plexus, because that is a very, very powerful target, and that is a very old target. People have known about this for a very long time. So as long as you can kick to the solar plexus and below without straining your mobility, you're probably good for like 99% of your needs. And then going higher than that is going to be just in the realm of athletics and fun and showing off and wanting to pursue something more just for personal and aesthetic and athletic reasons. So anyway, that concludes our little talk on high kicks and where they came from, and I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.